All right, I wanted to go ahead and do a lecture on Unit 2, which are chapters 3 and 4 out of the textbook. So we're going to get into just some of the mechanisms of how drugs work in the body and on the mind, and then we'll get started talking about cocaine abuse. So first of all, we got to talk about how drugs enter the body in the first place, and there's generally four different types. One is orally, of course, through the mouth, digesting it, and then it goes into the bloodstream, goes through the gastrointestinal tract. One thing about taking drugs orally is, of course, that they have to be able to survive the process of, the going through the stomach and the digestion and down through the intestines, and still be able to get into the bloodstream through the intestines intact. And sometimes that uses up a lot of the drug in the process. Some of them just can't survive that process. The second one's through injection, of course, which is where it can go directly into the bloodstream in some way. And even there's intravenous, right, where you shoot it right into the vein. Intramuscular, of course, goes into the muscular. Subcutaneous is where you just get it to go just under the surface of the skin. So of those, intravenous is, of course, the fastest one. People with heroin addictions, when they shoot that into the vein directly, it's right into the bloodstream, which goes right up into the brain. And it'll get into the brain in less than 15 seconds from shooting up. Inhalation, of course, is where you take it in through the nose or through the mouth, and it goes right into the lungs, and the lungs, of course, take oxygen right into the bloodstream. So again, it's a very quick route. One of the disadvantages, of course, is that burning something to inhale it, there's often a lot of poisonous or toxic particles that also end up getting into the lungs. It can also be absorbed through the skin. There are things you can put in the nose, into the rectum, onto the surface of the skin, where transdermal patches is one way. A lot of homeopathic medications are taken by putting them under the tongue, and they dissolve through the skin under the tongue. Now, what goes in must come out, so how the body processes and eliminates the drug will vary. Most often it's done by the liver, but it can also be processed in other ways, like through the kidneys. So that process is called biotransformation, and the chemicals of the drug are changed into what are called metabolites, or just various forms after being metabolized of the drug. And so a lot of factors determine the rate of that, including the quantity, how much you've got, how old the person is, the drug's fat solubility. A fat-soluble drug will be eliminated more slowly in most cases than a water-soluble drug. Now, this is an important concept, half-life. The half-life is the time it takes for the drug to be reduced by 50% in your bloodstream. So each additional interval of time also cuts it in half. So I'm not exactly sure, but I seem to remember that the half-life of caffeine in coffee is about 6 hours. So I drink this coffee here. About 6 hours from now, there will be the equivalent of half a cup of coffee in my bloodstream. 6 hours after that, there'll be the equivalent of about a quarter cup of coffee in my bloodstream. So, this is important. You can think, well, it's only 6 p.m., I'll have 3 cups of coffee. But 6 hours later at midnight, you'll still have a cup and a half full of coffee in your bloodstream. And then at 6 in the morning, you'll have, 3/4 of a cup of coffee left. So anyway, that can be a useful thing to know about drugs and how they impact you. There are also factors that impact the behavioral effect of drugs. One, of course, is the time interval between times that you've administered the drugs. Although there are some drugs that have a time release form. So for ADHD, which we'll talk about. Methamphetamine basically is what you're taking for that. It tends to wear off fairly quickly, so there are now XR and other versions that basically cleverly come up with ways of releasing it over time so it's not digested as quickly, etc. So it allows for a more continual absorption instead of just all at once and then fading away. There are also things to consider, like the interactions of drugs, and sometimes these can even be dangerous, so your pharmacy is always supposed to track things like interactions of drugs. Something like alcohol and cocaine actually interact pretty strongly. There are basically three different types. One is additive, and that basically means, like mathematically, you get this much effect from this much from this drug and this much effect from this drug. You add those together, that's the effect you're going to get. But some of them are hyper additive, which means they're synergistic, that as I was mentioning with alcohol and cocaine, you take them together and you get more of an effect than you would have gotten from just one or the other by themselves, or what you would expect from the two of them to add up together. There are also some drugs that are antagonistic, which means they cancel out the effect of another drug. So if you overdose on a certain drug, you might be given another drug to cancel out the effect of that one. So that's called antagonistic. Some drugs interact with each other with chronic usage. For instance, cross-tolerance means that if I get a tolerance for one drug, I'll also have a tolerance for another one. So for instance, if I drink a lot of alcohol and develop a tolerance for alcohol, then other barbiturates or things like Klonopin, benzodiazepines, I'll probably have a tolerance for those as well. Those won't have as much of an impact on me. Cross-dependence is also something that can happen where, but it can be a good thing in the sense of even though I'm dependent on one, I can take a different kind of drug and hopefully come down off of it. So for instance, with alcohol, if you are addicted to alcohol in the sense of you've got to have it or you have withdrawal symptoms, the half-life of alcohol, I think, is only 8 hours, so you might be given a benzodiazepine or something that has a much longer half-life, maybe 36 hours, so that the effects of the drug will wear off. But because there's a cross-dependence, you can substitute the benzo for the alcohol, and it'll help you come down off of it. Other times, people just end up addicted to different drugs if they don't do that consciously. There are also impacts of the person who's taking the drug, and their weight, their gender, their ethnic background and race. We've actually found different effects because of genetics on how the drugs actually affect a person. Let's talk about the nervous system, because that's where the drugs all take their effect, at least the ones we're going to most talk about in this course. So most of this should be review from other courses you've taken, but let's just quickly do that. First of all, we can divide it into the central and the peripheral nervous system, right? The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system is the nerves that go out, and we've got two pathways. We've got the pathway coming in, basically our sense receptors, and then we've got the pathways going out, which is motor control, muscle movement, right? There's an autonomic system, and that's divided in, meaning that it happens automatically, basically. And we can divide that into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems, right? The sympathetic has to do with stress response. Parasympathetic has to do with the relaxation response. So different drugs will affect these different systems, right? We'll talk about cocaine in a moment, which stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, gets people pumped up. Things like alcohol will activate more of the parasympathetic and get people more calmed down. Remember that the brain is divided into several sections, and different people do this in different ways. But basically, we can talk about the hindbrain or the brain stem. That's mostly concerned with life support types of functions. This includes the medulla, the pons, reticular formation, the cerebellum. The midbrain is a center for control for sensory and motor reflexes, body movements, processing of pain information. So the substantia nigra, I believe the basal ganglia would fall in that area. And we can talk about the forebrain, which would include both the limbic system, where the emotions are, hypothalamus, and basically the outer part of the brain, or the cortex, where most of the thinking happens and information processing, etc. So of all the areas within the cerebral cortex, the outermost layer, the most recently evolved is the prefrontal cortex. We've got the frontal cortex, and even in front of that, so to speak, is something that differentiates us from even the great apes. And interestingly, this is an area that doesn't even finish growing till our late 20s. And this area has to do with decision making and planning, emotional control. So people who end up abusing drugs a lot of times are interfering with this development, and what can happen is they sort of get, this is a little bit of a cliche, but it's often true, if you start abusing drugs in your teenage years, in a sense, emotionally, you get kind of stuck at a teenage level of maturity and ability to tolerate discomfort, etc., and your inability to plan for the future. And hopefully people can recover from that. But this is one of the reasons too why people can be so impulsive to even get caught up in drug abuse, as well as once they've used it, it interferes with that part of the brain and interferes with judgment and decision making, of course. So let's talk a little bit about the neurochemistry of what we would call psychoactive drugs, drugs that have an impact on our thinking and our psychology, basically. So they have their effects because they interfere with the neurons, and neurons are the parts, the cells of our brain, basically. And it consists of the body of the cell. The dendrites are what receive the information from elsewhere or from other cells, and the axon transmits the information on to the next neuron. And they estimate there's about 100 billion neurons in your brain alone. And when you start calculating that each one of those neurons connects to maybe thousands of others as well, it's quite a complex network. Now, where neurons communicate with each other is through a synapse. So in fact, the different cells of your brain, with some rare exceptions, don't actually touch each other. There's this little gap in between, and it's called the synapse. So basically one cell sends out chemicals that then cross the synapse and activate the next cell. And so this is one of the areas that the neurotransmitters or the drugs will affect. The neurotransmitters are the chemicals that go between through the synapses there. This is one of the places where the drugs that we take can interfere or even help that process, depending on what we're trying to do. And basically, there are 7 major neurotransmitters that we want to talk about, and that'll probably come up multiple times through the course. So basically, acetylcholine, norepinephrine, dopamine, 5-HTP or serotonin, gamma aminobutyric acid, everyone just calls it GABA, glutamate, and then a group basically known as endorphins. So those are the ones we'll be talking a lot today. Now, interestingly, you'll often hear these chemicals as often being excitatory or inhibitory, but it really depends on where the chemicals are acting as to whether or not they excite or inhibit. So when these chemicals go into the receptors, the way this neuron is set up, it may actually inhibit the actions of some other neurons, or it may go into a neuron that stimulates following some other thing. Another thing that can happen, of course, is that the drug fills the receptors, and now the natural receptors, the natural neurotransmitters of the brain can't get in there to activate it. Or having that drug in the bloodstream stimulates the next one more, because it thinks that that's the brain's chemicals wanting to do that. So, of course, there's a lot more details about that you've probably already learned in your courses, but just in the way of a review. So, let's see, physiological aspects of the drug-taking behavior. First of all, it's important to know there is actually a blood-brain barrier. There is a barrier between the brain and the bloodstream, and so only certain kinds of chemicals can get through. This is an environmental or evolutionary adaptation to prevent getting poison, right? When our ancestors lived in the wild and would just eat whatever they found, obviously it could damage the brain if it got there too quickly. In fact, the part of the blood-brain barrier that's the weakest is where the reflex to throw up actually is. So when you start to feel sick and want to throw up, it's your brain trying to throw it up before too much more gets into the bloodstream and can damage the brain. So first of all, they should be fat soluble and have a relatively small molecular size in order to pass through the blood-brain barrier. Another thing that happens physically is tolerance, and we've talked about that, of course, in the online forum discussions, but that basically means that the more of the drug you take, the less effect it has on you. Basically, your brain wants to be in balance. It wants to find homeostasis. So your brain may say, wow, there's more chemicals in my brain. I don't have to have as many receptors for it anymore, and so the receptors may die off. So that would be cellular tolerance, where the receptors themselves are changing over time. Metabolic tolerance occurs where the effect of the liver changes its effect. In other words, the liver may change the way that it processes the drug as it comes in over time if it's getting used to it being there. So a big piece of addiction, of course, is craving, and we do know that dopamine, especially in the nucleus accumbens, is where this gets really triggered and people really, really crave to have that drug again. And they've done studies where they would put electric receptors into this part of the brain, the nucleus accumbens, and if a rat pushed a lever, it would get a little stimulation there in that part of the brain. And these rats ended up starving to death because they only wanted to feel this sensation in their brain, and they didn't, they did that over any other activity until they literally starved to death. So it's a very powerful process that happens in the brain. Let's look at psychological aspects of this stuff. Any effect of a drug we can consider a three-way interaction, right? So the drug itself has pharmacological properties. There's the individual who's taking the drug and the variables there. And then there's the environment in which the drug-taking behavior occurs, or the setting, right? So the lower the drug dose, the greater the effect of those other variables. In fact, something called the placebo effect, where just my expectations of a certain drug can produce effect. I'm embarrassed to even say this, but I remember I witnessed somebody once saying, hey, watch this, this will be funny, and he pulled some leaves off of a bush in his front yard and rolled it up in a piece of paper, and some guy came over and he said, hey man, I've got some marijuana here, you should light up. And so the guy did, and he's asking him, so are you feeling it yet? And the guy really felt he was high, even though it was nothing but leaves off the bush in his front yard. So sometimes the expectations we have can produce the effects. There have been other times where people were given beer that had no alcohol in it, and they were acting really drunk and even got mad when the researcher told them, by the way, there's no alcohol in that, you're just, that's all happening in your mind. The person said, no, I'm really feeling drunk, and you can't tell me you didn't do that. And So there's a powerful piece. The placebo effect itself, I think, is something that we really should do more research on. But anytime we want to study a drug, we have to make sure the drug itself actually works. We've got to control for that placebo effect, right? So a double-blind procedure means the person taking the drug doesn't know if it's real or if it's placebo, and even the person administering the drug as part of the research study doesn't know if it's the real one or the placebo. You know, somebody somewhere has, you know, the big knowledge of who's getting what. But see, if I'm giving you the real drug, or if I know I'm giving you the placebo, the way I act with you may be different. So we want to take out that variable in research studies. So let's move on now to the chapter on cocaine, and I'll just want to highlight a few things about that. First of all, as you all probably know, cocaine's actually derived from the coca shrub. It's indigenous to the Andes in South America, and it's been used as a stimulant, you know, for over 5,000 years. The natives would just chew the leaves and get a little bit of stimulation that way. In the 19th century, this was really getting popular, and it became staple. I mean, it was just added in as a great thing in a lot of different tonics and medicines. And until 1903, as you may have read, coca leaves were even part of the recipe of Coca-Cola. That's how it got its name. So of course now they don't have any active Coca-Cola, active cocaine ingredients in Coca-Cola. And you know, there were some historical figures that really experimented with cocaine, including Sigmund Freud, who once wrote that he thought cocaine was wonderful because you could take cocaine and stay up all night and get lots of work done. But of course, he realized later that it was extremely addictive and took a terrible toll on his health, and he became terribly addicted and had to withdraw and get off of cocaine, and stopped promoting it as a good thing, of course. So as with all drugs, there are both acute and chronic effects. So acute meaning immediate, right away. So the primary acute effect of cocaine is just a powerful burst of energy and a feeling of euphoria or well-being. You just feel really great. But usually not all that long afterwards, you get the opposite. It's called the rebound effect. So because you got such a strong positive effect later, you've got almost the opposite, irritability and depression. So these are all caused by stimulation of that autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic nervous system. So I'm pumped up with my stress response system, basically, and the parasympathetic is inhibited. So over a period of time, this can, because your stress response is going when it really should only go for a minute or so at a time, you're going to end up with problems like cerebral hemorrhage, which means bleeding in the brain, cardiac arrhythmia, or heart pumping irregularly, or congestive heart failure, which is that your heart, the muscles of your heart get damaged, and so it just can't pump enough to keep up, and so you get sort of a backup in your bloodstream, so to speak. Another effect of repeated use of cocaine is not only depression, but paranoia and hallucinations. This is called cocaine psychosis. And of course, some problems with your nose if you're snorting the cocaine on a regular basis. But it's very interesting when I was working with people with chronic abuse of these kinds of things. They would describe some symptoms very similar to the people I was working with on inpatient psychiatric hospitals in terms of paranoia, worried that people could read their minds, and so they'd put on a tinfoil hat or aluminum foil hat to try to keep aliens from reading their thoughts and stuff like that. So it's it's really bad, of course, in the extreme. Physical signs of cocaine abuse include dilated pupils, increased heart rate, irritability, paranoia, sneezing and nose irritability if they're snorting it, of course depression, insomnia, decreased appetite, and a really big weight loss because you feel so great you just don't crave food so much. And of course your system is really fired up metabolically. Now, there were actually medical uses of cocaine, and it's still used every once in a while, sort of a local anesthetic, just on the surface of the skin. It can create a temporary anesthetic effect. In the brain, it really enhances the activity of dopamine and norepinephrine. So what happens, though, over time is that you're stimulating this dopamine so much that your system wears out, so to speak. And so people that chronically use that eventually become very depressed. And in fact, when they start to use again, they even don't get much out of it, so to speak. They're just trying to avoid the deep depression. And opposite of tolerance, cocaine has very often a kindling effect, meaning that the more you take it, the stronger the effects. So people have to watch out for the damage that can cause. Now, you don't hear as much about cocaine abuse as you used to. It's still very prevalent, but the peak of cocaine abuse occurred about 1986 or so, although the reports go back as far as 1970. But in that mid-80s era, a cheaper and smokable form of cocaine, crack cocaine, began to get popular. And I talked to clients who would say how much cheaper it was to take cocaine and make it into crack, and you could sell it and make a much better profit. Apparently it's easier to make. I didn't listen closely to the details of how it was done, but so again, remember, cocaine's taken from the coca plant. So people that chewed the leaves in the Andes, they got some effect, but where it became a problem is where they would really refine it and purify it, right? So so people will take coca leaves and make it into coca paste. And coca paste has a purity of about 60% cocaine. When you take some additional steps and convert that paste into a water-soluble form known as cocaine hydrochloride, that's about 99% pure cocaine. Now, freebase cocaine is where you convert that salt, the hydrochloride, chloride referring to salt base. You can convert that salt form to a freebase. And crack cocaine's made in a similar way, but the process is much less hazardous. Freebasing is, really dangerous. The effect of smoked crack cocaine is much stronger than snorting the powdered form through the nose. And it may be because you're taking it directly into your lungs, as I mentioned, and the lungs go straight into the bloodstream, which goes straight into the brain. So that's probably one of the reasons. So crack cocaine abuse is still a pretty big problem, but the number of new crack cocaine abusers is declining compared to what it used to be. So even though the overall prevalence rates of using cocaine have gone down, there are still some pretty awful statistics. The one the book gives is in 2011 alone, just in that 1 year, there were 505,000 emergency room visits because of cocaine. So it's still a pretty serious thing. So again, even though the numbers of cocaine and crack abuse have gone down, it's still a pretty significant problem. So treatment programs. First of all, the biggest thing is detoxification and detox, and stopping completely, just abstinence. This is not something you kind of use a little bit of every now and then. This is one that's pretty important to get clean because it takes your brain a while to recover from it. For some people, even 4 months later, their brain is still really strongly craving it and affected because of the use that they had. So it takes time for your brain to sort of redevelop, regrow itself, change the receptors back. So there is something called Cocaine Anonymous, modeled after Alcoholics Anonymous, the self-help 12-step group that many people find helpful. And there's cognitive behavioral therapy and other types of therapies that are often helpful. There have been some experiments with looking at some drugs. One is, I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce it, vigabatrin. And it seems like the trials are looking pretty good, but pretty good is a relative term because for that drug, one of the trials the book mentions that it helped 14 out of 50 people. So 14 out of 50 is still not very many, but it's better than the placebo group, which only 4 out of 53 in the placebo group actually got better. So at least it's better than placebo, but still a lot of problems there, obviously. Now, amphetamines as stimulants, and in a controlled form, they're very helpful for ADHD. This is an interesting thing because a lot of times ADHD, there's inattention, of course, but there's also hyperactivity. So isn't it interesting that we give people with ADHD methamphetamine and it calms them down? And really what we think is happening is the frontal lobes that I mentioned are getting stimulated, and this part of the brain has to do with decision making, as I mentioned, and controlling your emotions and making good decisions instead of being impulsive. And it's a similar effect that coffee has, right? If I drink some caffeine here, it stimulates my frontal lobe and I can concentrate a little bit better. Methamphetamine is a more potent form of amphetamine. And of course, you'll often hear it just referred to as meth or speed. And this modification makes it pass more quickly through the blood-brain barrier, which is why it's so powerful. Originally this was derived from a Chinese medicinal herb, and it was finally isolated in 1887, and the first time it was sold was in 1932, as a matter of fact. It's very helpful for individuals with ADHD or fatigue. It dilates the bronchioles in the lungs, so it can be helpful in that sense. But it reached a peak of abuse around 1967 once people started using this recreationally. And it kind of slowed over the 1970s. However, back in the mid-1990s, it really resurfaced in the form of meth, and that's been a huge problem. One of the reasons is because you can manufacture it yourself if you have the right ingredients, although there's danger in manufacturing it, of course. So generally, amphetamines increase dopamine and norepinephrine activity in the brain, and really produces that euphoria that I mentioned, feeling of happiness and well-being. And then there's the craving for them once it's gone out of your system. So this seems to be related to the dopamine activity in the brain. So the acute and chronic effects. Acute effects are with amphetamines are much like those of cocaine that we mentioned. That euphoria, well-being, burst of energy that happens initially. Let's see, I lost my place here. Something's going on with my computer. But just as I mentioned with the heavy use, chronic use of meth, lots of disturbing hallucinations, paranoia, compulsive, repetitive kinds of behaviors, intense mood swings, even violence, because the feelings and the emotional cravings can get so intense that it starts to overcome your ability to reason, of course. Collectively, those are known as amphetamine psychosis. And as I mentioned before, I worked with people that really got hallucinations and thinking that aliens were getting into their brain and all kinds of stuff from heavy meth use. So as I mentioned, in the mid-1990s, just as crack cocaine and powder cocaine use was starting to go down, that's when amphetamines came back on the in terms of meth, became much more popular. And it can be snorted, injected, smoked. So it's pretty widespread, and there's certainly a lot of rural areas of the country, including around the Cincinnati area, that have had some pretty serious problems with this. Meth labs have been popping up, especially in small towns and rural areas. So they take anhydrous ammonia, which is a farm fertilizer, so you can find that, and pseudoephedrine, which used to be sold over the counter as a cold medicine. They're making it much harder to get that nowadays. But you take those, and basically they're the most important ingredients to create that. So smokable meth, or crystal meth, has become a pretty big drug, club drug. So since the late 90s, there's been a lot of concern over the spread, because it's gotten into areas that typically don't have as much drug use because of the ease with which it can be made. So a lot more controls are being put on there. If you may have noticed, for some cold remedies, you have to actually show ID and sign your name so they can track it federally of who's buying it, so they can track it down if they need to. So, thousands of meth labs in the U.S. have been raided recently in the last decade or so, and so it's still a big problem, but people are working to combat it now. The patterns of meth use are different from patterns of cocaine abuse. Generally, meth users need to keep going pretty regularly throughout the day to keep that going, which is why it has such awful side effects of losing teeth and malnutrition and all these things. Whereas cocaine abusers tend to use it in the evening hours or nighttime, more like in a binge kind of a way, more instead of a regular, constant kind of a way. So meth usually lasts about 10 hours or more, whereas cocaine only lasts about 20 to 30 minutes. But the withdrawal from both is pretty similar. Meth abusers find it pretty difficult to become drug-free. So of all the different drugs that we'll be talking about, illicit drugs that is, this is one of the hardest ones to get off. It's just so addictive, and the withdrawal effects are so bad. As I mentioned, there are some medical uses for these stimulant drugs like amphetamine. Primarily, as I mentioned, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And current estimates are about 3 to 10% of school-age kids have ADHD. So there are different forms. Ritalin is methylphenidate. Concerta is a time-release form of Ritalin. A combination of dextroamphetamine and amphetamine is Adderall, and there's a long-acting version of Adderall as well, Adderall XR. And Vyvanse is a combination of dextroamphetamine and the amino acid lysine that seems to be helpful for a lot of individuals with ADHD. Now, one of the side effects of taking these meds, especially for kids that have ADHD, is it does suppress growth, both in terms of height and weight, if it's taken when you're really young. So you may only grow to 80 or 90% of what you are supposed to be if you're taking it consistently. But it does appear that if you take drug holidays, so if you stop taking it on weekends, and if you stop taking it in the summertime, usually your body catches up and it's not as much of a problem. You'd have to watch out though, because of, just as with the abuse, when you stop taking it, you kind of have that rebound effect, and you tend to have low energy, not much motivation, and maybe even depression sometimes. Of course, when it's a prescribed dose, then it's usually not as powerful. It tends to enter the bloodstream more gradually and leave more gradually, so the effects are not as bad, of course, as the abuse. One of the problems, though, is that these drugs, because they're stimulants, because they're amphetamine, is they're subject to abuse. So people with ADHD may sell them to make a quick buck. Someone else may want to take them just to be able to stay up or have more energy, and sometimes they're crushed and snorted and sometimes even injected. So that's a big issue. If you're getting a prescription for this, you literally have to go to your doctor's office. It may vary, I'm not sure if it varies state by state. I know in Ohio you've got to go to the doctor's office in person every time you want to get your prescription. So every single month you have to show up and show them your ID and make sure that you're the person receiving this prescription, and you have to have a full appointment with the doctor at least every 6 months, I think it is, if you want to be on this drug. So let's see, another form of stimulant that's recently been developed for narcolepsy. Narcolepsy, of course, is falling asleep when you don't want to or unexpectedly. There's something called Provigil, modafinil, and it's not so much an amphetamine, but it stimulates the brain into wakefulness. There's a newer form called Nuvigil as well. So that's all I've got on stimulants here for this lecture. So we'll talk more in the forums.